Welcome to the Bird's Eye View. This series is not meant to be a political or cultural commentary, nor is it a nitpick or comprehensive review. What we will be doing is diving into entertainment to try to understand its message, how well it accomplishes this, what we can learn from it, and how it might be improved. So let's look into it. In this video, we're going to be looking into how to improve She-Hulk. Now that we've looked at some of the ways in which it's failed or has had issues, let's look at how we can actually improve it. The message of She-Hulk is about perception and how it impacts how we view ourselves and how the world views us, and how in turn that changes our lives and changes how we behave. So that being said, the core plot of what I'm going to talk about going forward will be hinged around this message. What I'm going to try and change and mess with is not the small gripes that I had, like some of the humor or the bad CGI. Instead, what I'm going to be working on is how to make the story better for the message, in service of the message, and not just the extra stuff or the stuff that simply is secondary to the message itself. So the message we're trying to propagate going forward is a message of dealing with the perception of others in a positive way, not shutting people out, not letting them see who you really are, while at the same time pushing back on that harmful message and viewing other people in a more accepting, holistic way. So we're trying to take the best parts of that message, but instead fill it out and make it more well-rounded, instead of the somewhat slanted version that She-Hulk had, which I don't think was totally on purpose. I think part of it was just some of the mistakes that it had and undercut the message on the whole. So now that we know the message, some of the problems we had with the show itself was that She-Hulk as a character was not very well thought out, meaning instead of being a three-dimensional, interesting character with motivations we understood, instead She-Hulk was somewhat of a caricature, a stereotype of this high-powered female lawyer. Well, in our rewrite, what we're going to try and do is stick to making She-Hulk a more well-rounded character, trying to show who she really is, trying to fill in those details. The other problem we want to take a look at are the villains. The villains in She-Hulk were a big weak spot, which is true of a lot of Marvel properties. So what we want to do in this is make the villains foreshadowed from the beginning. We want to make the villains the same and something that we build over time, that we foreshadow, unravel, and see as time progresses, rather than be a big surprise at the end. Also, something that goes hand in hand with this is we want the villains, similarly to She-Hulk, to also be something that is fleshed out, also something that is three-dimensional. We want, because of the message being so much about perception and truly understanding people for who they are on a deeper level, we want the villains to also have a similar treatment. So now that the ground rules have been set for how we're going to fix She-Hulk, let's look into some of the big things we're going to change first and foremost. Well, the first big thing I want to say is a lot of the extra characters, they would be gone. We would axe them completely, delete them out, because that extra time that can be freed up should be going to our main character, She-Hulk, and Intelligentsia. Those two are the ones we should be developing the most, because the hero and the interaction between the hero and their villain are one of the most important aspects to any property, but in particular, a Marvel property. The other thing is that any characters that are left after we get rid of all the other superfluous characters, those ones I really want to take a little bit of time with and flush them out, make them three-dimensional so they have something to say, they have something to add and comment on the greater message and story. So that to me would be people like Abomination. He would definitely stay. Nikki, her best friend, should definitely stay. Now we can have Daredevil in for a short time. I don't think that changes too much, but Titania should go, or at least her extra appearances should go. The good attorney, the good male attorney, he should also go. The toxic male attorney should go. The boss can be in there for a short amount of time, but he should also go with any extra scenes, because there's no reason for those scenes to be given to extra characters when they can be given to Jennifer to really dive into what makes her different and unique. So now let's talk about what makes her different and unique, and how we're going to build that into our new series. The number one way we're going to do this is by taking the entire first episode and making that a flashback. It's going to be very similar to a lot of other TV shows and how they set up their main character or just the plot by going back in time. And that's what I want to do with her. I want to go back to high school and we're going to look at how she was back then, because that's going to be a big commentary to the person that she is today. Now imagine a POV shot where we see the back of a minivan and her parents in the front seats bringing her to her first day of school. They talk about how pretty she looks, how she's so prepared, and they're really hyping her up for this first day. Then Jennifer goes inside, goes into this, and by the way, this is all shot from a POV, so you don't really see what she looks like. But they wish her good luck, they're taking pictures, being kind of typical parents in that way, and making Jennifer, of course, feel really self-conscious. But they're saying things like, oh, we love your outfit, you're looking great, and a lot of it, I really want to emphasize, is about how she looks. They're talking about how beautiful she is, etc. But we don't see how she looks yet, it's just from the POV. Now this plays into the greater message of perception like we were talking about before. So she walks into the high school, and all from the POV shot, we don't see how she looks. And then we have an outside view. And the outside view is of this tall, beautiful young girl, and it just looks very picturesque, like exactly what you would imagine a young She-Hulk might look like. And then she walks away, shuts it, and we see Jennifer behind her, looking younger, shorter, dorkier, and just very much a stereotype of what you think a young, dorky, nerdy girl might look like. Then, during the course of her first day, she gets bullied by some of the other girls for this board game that she's into. Now, I want this to be some sort of analog, maybe some sort of Marvel version, off-brand version of Dungeons & Dragons, something like that. But she's really into this kind of nerdy board game. She gets made fun of for it, and she comes home crying until she gets a call. And her parents come up and say, oh, someone's on the line for you, and it ends up being Bruce. Bruce then comes over, and they play that Dungeons & Dragons board game together. And from there, we get a montage of her in high school. She gets bullied, but she gets a closer relationship with Bruce. Bruce helps her study math and science, while she helps him study history and English, and they really get a closer connection. Well, during this montage, you see that she also started to have a crush on this boy in English class. So then, towards the end of this montage, she finally summons up the courage to ask her crush out, and to ask him to come over and play the D&D game, or just come over. So she does that. Meanwhile, in the back of class, there's this other nerdy kid, who, unlike her, doesn't have any friends, doesn't see anyone, and is just by himself. But you can see that he also starts to have a crush on her. So finally, he summons up the courage to ask her to come to his D&D off-brand thing. Something that the Marvel kids in this universe are into at this time. So he finally asks her, and she says that she can't do it because she invited her crush over to her house. So the crush comes over and they end up studying together. They're both really interested in English and some of the literature stuff, and they both get this camaraderie over their shared interest. Well, over time, maybe a couple months, whatever, there's a school dance that comes up, and that same dorky kid who was interested in her to begin with comes up to her and tries to get her to go out with him for the dance. Well, she says no, because she's planning to ask her crush out. So when the crush finally comes over, she goes to ask him, and this is where you get somewhat of a pivotal moment for her character. He says no, he was planning to go with the same bully that had been bullying Jennifer this whole time. And she gets angry with this, but rather than just get angry, she then makes this very well-reasoned, lawyer-like argument about all the problems with his decision and how she's stupid, she doesn't understand the same references that they do, they don't have anything in common, and really he's just being shallow and looking at her for how she looks, rather than what's deeper and actually wanting a relationship. And he goes through this whole thing, but of course, it goes over his head because he's just a teenage boy, and he walks away. Then right after, Bruce comes over with a present for her, not knowing what happened, but in the earlier montage it had been set up that they're both studying to take their SATs at some point. So She really wanted this expensive SAT book to help them study, but she didn't have enough money for it. So he comes in and gives her this, and they both end up studying. And it's this moment where you can see this connection of something real, of someone who knows each other and who are choosing each other to spend time with each other for who they are, for their common interests, for their relationship, over just the shallow things like the boy from before. Well, meanwhile, that same dorky boy who had asked her out is all by himself at home, having no one to go to the dance. I'd want this scene just to be a quiet, emotional moment where we get to see how lonely he is, in contrast with the connection that She-Hulk has built with Bruce. And Bruce and her together are studying, and even though she's sad at being rejected, still she has that connection with someone who really understands her and was willing to do something as sweet as getting the present for her like he did, while the dorky boy on the other hand didn't have anyone. In the next scene, She-Hulk and Bruce both graduate and get separate offers for schools in different parts of the United States. So they both have this heartfelt goodbye, and in that time, Jennifer gives him a really heartfelt present that was set up in a previous montage. Maybe it's one of the character cards from a board game, something like that, but something that you can tell means a lot to Bruce. So we have that heartfelt goodbye, and they both split up and go to college. Meanwhile, we see the younger, dorky kid leave their graduation early and just disappear. Jennifer then ends up going to college, and on her first day, a group of girls that look like the same type of girls who are bullying her all throughout high school come up to her table and start to mock her. Well, then Nikki, her future best friend, comes up to them and tells them to go F themselves or uses some witty comment to make them go away. And she then looks at Jennifer and says, "This isn't high school anymore. It's time to grow a pair." And the end credit montage, or the thing that's on the side while the credits roll, during that time you can see how Jennifer and her both work together. Jennifer helps to teach her how to study better and to get better grades, while Nikki helps teach her confidence. And during the last credit scene, the after credit scene, she looks at the camera and says, "I'm Jennifer Walters," and then it cuts to black. I know I spent a lot of time just on that first episode, but I really wanted to set up some core things. First, I wanted to set up the idea of perception, of course, like we've talked about before, when it comes to how she's bullied for how she appears, and for her being more nerdy, and also setting up that POV shot, which I think does a good job of symbolically showing the problem of perception, of being seen as just what you are on the outside. I also, at the same time, really want to show the connection between Bruce and Jennifer, and also how the importance of showing someone who you really are is in contrast to the dorky kid earlier, and I'm going to show how he's set up as something bigger in the future. But I think these set up some very core things when it comes to She-Hulk and her character. That at her core, she's really just a nerdy, dorky character who likes obscure literature references and history and really enjoys debating those things, and that's something that she enjoys. And she's also into this random board game, and she still likes it. Later on in the show, we'll hit back on that. How this version of her, the more complete version of who she is something that many people, men and other women, don't accept as the version of femininity or as the version of womanhood that she feels like she should be. Now, to hit on the rest of the show very quickly, I think there are going to be some big changes that we'll make with the rest of the show, but mostly we're going to stick to the same bones. The biggest change was just that first episode and trying to set up who she is and some of the core elements. But I think as the show progresses, some of the big things we want to change is, rather than getting the lawyer job because she was She-Hulk, instead, I want it to be because she defended Bruce. I think that she should keep her secret identity because it shows that she's still struggling with the acceptance of this secret identity, and she can't really accept that she's not Jennifer anymore. So she still gets her powers in the same way as the TV show, but instead, she doesn't show that to the rest of the world. She doesn't even show that to her friends. So the reason she gets this superhero lawyer job isn't because of her superpowers, but instead because she did such a good job defending Bruce in some way. So he could have, stepped on a cat for all we care. But she did such a good job defending him that everyone wants her to work as their superhero defender. Meanwhile, she starts being targeted online for some reason she doesn't understand, and this starts to ramp up, and there's weird occurrences when it comes to villains and her being targeted, and so she starts to investigate what's going on, And that's when she uses She-Hulk at night to start investigating some things that are happening that seem mysterious around her. And with this, starts coming more and more about intelligentsia as the episodes progress. So partly there's this mystery element of what's going on. Why is she being targeted? And what are all these new things with intelligentsia? And one evidence leads to another. And so at night, she investigates these things. And she gets caught on camera and then eventually named by the media. And you get a lot of the same types of scenes where the media is bad-mouthing her, talking about all the terrible things that she's been doing at night when it comes to crime fighting or just investigating things. And the people that she ends up going out with, all these different men, still have the same ideas about She-Hulk because she becomes this new rage. And we'll say maybe because the only thing that fits her is spandex. And so because of that, the revealing photos that have gone up on the internet end up tantalizing all these different men, so everyone becomes obsessed with her because she's this ideal version of a woman when she is in her She-Hulk form. This brings me to her dating life, where instead of what it was in the show, I want it more to be about her wanting to find a partner who is really interested in her for who she is, who wants to be there for Jennifer, and isn't there for this short-term hookup. But instead, while on these dates, everyone seems very short-term focused. But more than that, they keep bringing up She-Hulk during their conversation. So no matter where she goes, she cannot avoid She-Hulk. It has this somewhat feminized version of Spider-Man and how he can't avoid it either. And so during these conversations, she still has the same feeling of never really being seen until she goes out with one person who actually seems to genuinely be interested in her. However, he's younger than her, he seems really dorky and somewhat socially awkward, and of course he lives at home, and his job is all from home. He doesn't even have a car or a driver's license, so she just kind of ignores him and blows him off, even though they were the ones who had the deepest conversation. During this time, a lot of the same story beats play out as the show. A lot of the same courtroom scenes and issues play out. However, a lot of the extraneous things, though, the background characters and the extra stuff, that's given to She-Hulk to show how much she's struggling with her secret identity, how much she's struggling with the fact that she wants to be seen more for who she really is. She wants to show Nikki, for instance, her best friend, that she is in fact She-Hulk. That's who she is at night, and yet there's something within her that stops her from showing who she is. So we get to see a little bit behind the curtain of what's going on. At the same time, you get to also see some of the more idiosyncratic parts of her, like how maybe she goes to a weekly board game meeting with a lot of her friends, and that's when she talks about some of the issues with She-Hulk in this coded language, similar to how Stranger Things talks about D&D characters when it comes to whatever monster they're fighting. And so she uses the same coded language to somewhat talk about the things she's struggling with. So we get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for who She-Hulk really is and all of the extra scenes that we've deleted from those secondary characters. Then the wedding scene plays out, and the difference with this, though, is that rather than stealing the spotlight, she ends up just being Jennifer and feeling like she's in the background of someone else's big day and not feeling like she ever gets a chance to have what they have. That's when she meets the same guy that she meets in the show. They start hooking up and going out, and then of course he leaves. So it plays out very similarly. Then she goes to her therapy session, and unlike what happens there, she really opens up more and gives us more of a peek into who she is and what she really wants, rather than what we had in the show. However, it still happens in a very similar way. But then we finally get to the dinner, and this is where something really changes. Rather than intelligentsia exposing her for having sex with some random dude, instead, it's more about them exposing her secret identity, because no one else knows. And this leads to a big blow-up, where she does end up destroying a lot of property, but rather than just framing it like, oh, She-Hulk is having a tantrum, like I feel the show did, instead, in our version, what she does is really Hulk out and rage out in a way that does seem like it threatens lives, that does seem like it's monumental, like she could really hurt people. And then she gets incarcerated. Now before this, since she had that encounter with the guy at night, her last encounter with him, she seems to have been getting a little bit weaker, a little more shaky. And then finally, when she's in the prison cell, we get to see that she's struggling even more. Maybe she starts having a tremor, or she starts getting really bad headaches, but something like that. So then Nikki and Abomination come in, and they break her out, saying that they have new leads, and they think they know where Intelligentsia's headquarters are. So she gets out, and she finally goes to confront Intelligentsia. So then She-Hulk makes her way to the headquarters. But before she goes, she tells Abomination and she tells Nikki that she doesn't want to go with anyone else because she doesn't want Nikki to be hurt or Abomination to lose his privileges. So then she makes her way inside, and it turns out to be her old high school. And it's revealed that the same dorky kid who had asked her out has been behind Intelligentsia this whole time. And he was also the same person to set up She-Hulk from the beginning by trying to take Hulk's powers with the accident. So he's the one who sabotaged their car and drove them off the road so he could take the powers for themselves, because all of the anger at society, at how he'd been treated, at how he'd been perceived by other people, had drove him to the point where he wanted to use his anger as a weapon, just like Hulk. Not to mention, he was also the same person who went on a date with She-Hulk earlier, who went on a date with Jennifer and actually showed interest. But even though he was the one who showed the most interest, and who, from a personality standpoint, she actually vibed with the most, still, he was rejected based upon how he appeared, based upon the shallow details. So this frames She-Hulk as the hypocrite in the situation, as someone who is guilty of all the problems that she's been having with other people this whole time. So after this happens, they then get in this fight, and when this fight happens, it's revealed that when the wedding person infiltrated her, or whatever you want to call it, when the spy ended up sleeping with her at night, he also drugged her in addition to taking away her DNA. So she's weaker, much weaker than she had been in the past because of this. So she ends up losing, and when she's losing, she looks at the camera and says something like, well, look at this, isn't this contrived? And then she ends up having the same sequence, just like before, where she comes out of the Disney menu, she ends up confronting the writers, and then we get some interesting scenes where she rewinds it and looks back at her childhood, and looks back at the ways he was treated from his perspective, instead of just looking at it through her narrow POV, like the beginning, like we made a point of doing at the beginning. Instead, she uses Kevin and the ability of the writers to look at it from his perspective, and to understand what he was going through. And as she does this, she realizes that she had been in the wrong too. How she had judged other people in a very shallow way. And she remembers back to when she looked at all the different dating profiles, and how all she did was look at the surface level details, and how she had done this, frankly, a great deal throughout her time, and had even done this with herself, with how she was as She-Hulk, and how she didn't accept that not only was she Jennifer, but she was also She-Hulk. Furthermore, what this also does, and this is the next big point, is that she looks at how her life differed from his. And the big difference was that she had people in her life, people that she talked to. She had Bruce. During that same moment at the first episode, when he was all alone during the dance, she had Bruce. She always had friends who she confided in. But yet, recently, she had pushed them away because she didn't want to show who she really was. She didn't want to come clean as She-Hulk. And so she realizes one of the big differences was her friendships and relationships, and opening up, being vulnerable and open with who she really was. So she then uses the power of the writers and Kevin to summon Abomination and Hulk to come and help her. And she says, I really need your help. So they all team up and stop him together. And once he's stopped, he's taken into custody, and she's exonerated because it's shown that she was drugged and then she was set up, etc. However, in mine, there's one more episode. In this last episode, you get to see how she's changed. She comes clean to Nikki and to Bruce, tells them what she's been going through and who she really is, and how things have changed. And then she comes out to all of the media. She has a big press conference, and she owns the fact that she is She-Hulk, very reminiscent of Iron Man in the first Iron Man, saying, I am Iron Man. She says, I am She-Hulk. But then the next thing she does is she takes the villain as her next client. She takes Intelligentsia and then tries to defend him in a court of law. And towards the end of the show, we get to see some really interesting scenes between Intelligentsia and She-Hulk, and they get a chance to really understand each other a bit more. For She-Hulk to show to the audience that she really has changed, and she really has understood the greater lessons of accepting who you are and accepting other people, and how that is somewhat of the antidote to this problem of perception. This has been the Bird's Eye View. I hope this series has done a good job of understanding and improving the message of She-Hulk. I would really like to know your thoughts down below, particularly about the rewrite. Did I do a good job improving the message? Or how would you have changed it and made it better? You're welcome for the video, and I'll see you in the next one.